I'll just do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and any other people who have a connection to this country. I want to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, and the historic and ongoing contributions to the community sector that they make. I would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I will now pass on to Scott to introduce and kick off the session.
Thanks, Leanne, and apologies for our lateness. We had another group in this meeting room before we started. I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and recognise any other people or families with connections to the ACT and the region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I'd also like to welcome any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. As Leanne mentioned, my name's Scott Austin. I'm the Acting Deputy Under Treasurer for Budget, Procurement, Investments and Finance. I'm joined in the room here by colleagues Rowena Melling and Tom Callaghan, who are part of our Budget Coordination branch. Tom heads up the branch, and they're responsible for pulling the budget together. I looked at the calendar and realised that we did this session on exactly the same date last year, so 12th of June last year, in advance of the ACT budget. So we do have a session. I think Leanne's organised another session for August where we talk through the budget process, but the focus today will be very much on how you make sense of the budget papers. And I will admit there's a lot of detail in there, and I'm sort of experiencing that at the moment. We've finished our decision-making process now. The government's made all its decisions. We're in the process of pulling all the numbers together and all the narrative. So there's a lot of work there and a lot of numbers to be checked. So I do appreciate that it can be quite complex. The budget timeline, an important part of our process is the consultation process. We have a survey that's available for part of the year for all members of the community. We also have the budget roundtable process, which we conducted in February. And I think there were 3 sessions for ACTCOSS for its members, and they're very valuable for us. And that process is useful not so much for Treasury, but for the directorates who brief their ministers on issues that come up through those sessions, and that briefing sort of informs proposals that are brought forward through the budget process. I think we're unique also in having a year-round sort of submissions process where people can put in submissions at any time, but obviously we start our decision-making process in February, so having those submissions in by the end of the calendar year each year can really inform that process. As I mentioned, the roundtables, I think as well, there's a pretty unique context for this year's budget with the health funding pressures that we've identified through the budget review process. Other states and territories, recently Victoria and Tasmania, released their budgets, which also had to supplement health funding for those jurisdictions. So it sets the context for a very difficult and very tight budget process. As I mentioned, the roundtables as well. The other thing the ACT is going through at the moment is a very large infrastructure program, 8.2 billion over 4 years. So it's not quite a record, but it's a very large sort of investment program. We've got light rail, we've got a Northside Hospital that is yet to commence. We've got CRT Woden that will shortly be completed. So there's a few projects in there as well that sets the context for our process. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Ro? What we're going to do today is basically talk you through the budget and its associated papers. So I think the most logical way to do that is to structure around how the budget itself is structured. The main document is the budget outlook, which includes the narrative and some of the key financial aggregates, but also the initiatives. So the initiatives where the government gets to identify its priorities for this budget. But there are also a lot of documents that relate to agency specifically, so agency financial statements. There's a cost of living supplement as well, which is required to be published with the budget. It might be, if you can move to the next slide, Ro. The main chapters and associated documents are outlined there. And I guess The budget itself is a signature document for the government. It identifies their priorities for this fiscal year in terms of initiatives. It sets out the fiscal strategy. It sets out the economic outlook, which is obviously a very important part of the fiscal outlook as well. It also provides an accountability piece for the Assembly and the people of the ACT. So agencies need to report against accountability indicators to tell the public how they're delivering against the funding they've been provided. And what I might do is just briefly mention the Financial Management Act 1996 sets out what needs to be in a budget. And I'll take you through some of those things because it's quite illustrative to why the budget is set up the way it is. And this is something you can find online, so it's quite easy to access. So Section 11 of the Financial Management Act sets out what the budget must include. It must include a financial policy objective and strategy statement. It must include a statement of the economic or other assumptions used to make the budget estimates. It must include a statement about the sensitivity of the budget estimates to changes in the economic or other assumptions, and a statement of the risks, quantified if possible, that may affect the budget estimates, including contingent liabilities, and the financial statements required under the financial management guidelines. And for those of you who have dipped into the budget papers, you'll see that's quite a substantial amount of information. It also must include a statement about the effect of the following on an ACT household for the financial year. Territory taxes and fees that have a direct effect on the household, territory concessions that offset the taxes and fees mentioned in the subparagraph above. So that's a cost of living statement that we talked about before. The other thing it must include is a statement about the government's spending intentions for the financial year, including any significant change in spending intentions from the previous year. So again, it's that accountability piece to identify where the new priorities are. The next part of that section then says the proposed budget may include anything else the Treasury considers relevant. So that really emphasises this is a government document. It's not a Treasury document. I mean, we pull it together, but all the text, well, everything really is cleared by the Treasurer. So it is a government document that sets out their priorities. I might just move on to the next slide, please, Ro. And so we mentioned before, there are other statements as well that supplement the information in the budget. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander budget statement, women's budget statement, housing statement, we talked about the cost of living statement. So they're all online documents that you can access after the budget's released. Move to the next slide, please, Ro. ColourWorks database is a really important asset, I think, for the community. It sets out project by project funding for all our major initiatives. It divides them up by portfolios as well. So it's an Excel database, so you can go online and sort of look through that and identify where the major projects are. Obviously, as I mentioned before, some of the big ones are light rail and the Northside Hospital, but you've got schools being built all the time, roads, various assets being developed. We also have the asset renewal program, which is a way that agencies get to maintain the assets they've got. So that's an amount of money that we set aside for those agencies to identify priorities, playgrounds, parks. It covers the entire gambit of the role of the ACT government. The next bit on the slide is what you will all have seen with your rates notice as well, which is where the money goes from the budget. And not surprisingly, almost a third, and probably this year it will be a third given the extra money the government will be putting into health. A third of the budget close to goes to health, about a quarter goes to education. You can see around that circle the various other attributes or other functions that the money goes to, including community services, justice, economic development, environment, transport, that sort of thing. Next slide, please, Roy. I guess it's important to know what the budget doesn't do, although it's a fairly comprehensive document, and this is a question we often get asked by the community sector is, where is the funding for particular organisations? Now, it may be that in an initiative description, we'll come to those a little bit later, it may be the government will call out specific additional funding for community organisations, but the responsibility for providing that funding sits with the agencies who provide it. So we have a broad characterisation of funding that goes to, say, CSD, but within that, they will decide, based on the purposes the government has provided the money and the Assembly's voted it for, how that is allocated to agencies. So we don't get visibility of particular agency NGO funding, but there are ways you can find that, or probably the best way to do it is to contact the relevant directorate. We'll also be sending out, the Treasurer will send out budget day letters as well, summarising the key aspects of the budget. Next slide, please, Brian. I should also mention, I'm happy if people want to sort of interrupt as we go through with questions. If there's something I skip over or is not clear, please pull me up. And again, I guess just to emphasise what we said in the previous slide, that really a key part for community members, I think, is probably that section of the budget outlook, chapter 3.2, which talks about the new initiatives. We'll get onto it later, but new initiatives themselves are probably a very small subset of the total amount the government spends. The government spends about $9 billion a year. If you look back to the last year's 24-25 budget, new initiatives are probably worth about 300 million of that. So it's only a small percentage, 1-3% of the total spend that are identified in the new initiative section. The bulk of funding which goes out for all the services the government provides are in the funding base of directorates. So, and that's historical. It goes right back to even pre-self-government, when funding transferred from the Commonwealth. So I guess it's really key to remember that the new policy decisions announced in the budget will only be a small proportion of spending going forward. Next slide, please, Ryan. The other thing the budget outlook does, obviously, is provide a key overarching perspective of the fiscal position. The metric that we use to reflect our, if you like, budget deficit is the headline net operating balance. The ACT, amongst several other jurisdictions, uses accrual accounting. There might be an apocryphal story, but there's a story about a senator a number of years ago who got confused and talked about accrual accounting. Thought the accountants were torturing numbers or something. But accrual accounting basically is what it's trying to do is to say, when do the benefits and costs to the community accrue? So hence accrual accounting. So we look at expenses, which looks at, I guess, a cost to the community and when they accrue. So this contrasts with the Commonwealth, which, although it does have accrual measures as well, their focus is on payments. So they'll focus on the cash flows. So see with the Commonwealth budget, it's a payments versus revenue thing. So a key example where accrual accounting differs from cash accounting is that when you hire a new employee, obviously the cash payments are the wages you pay that employee, which need to be accounted for. Accrual accounting will also say that in taking that employee on, you take on liabilities for leave and other superannuation associated with that employee. Another example of where accrual accounting differs from the Commonwealth approach of cash accounting is with concessional loans, something like HEX. In a cash accounting sense, a concessional loan is great because you account the payments towards your balance, your budget balance, but you don't identify the concessional loan component of the interest rate that you're charging. So accrual accounting, which we use in the ACT, is meant to be all-encompassing. So it picks up all the changes to your liabilities and your assets. So revenue, typically they'll be fairly similar to a cash revenue concept, but expenses, as I said, will pick up that broader concept of when you take on new liabilities at the time in which you make the decision. So essentially, the net operating balance, which is a standard accrual measure, is the difference between revenue and expenses. In the ACT, we're unique because of all Australian jurisdictions, we don't run our own public superannuation scheme. So what we do is we adjust the net operating balance to add in a superannuation return adjustment. And what that's saying is, so for people like me who've come from the Commonwealth, the liabilities are to the Commonwealth superannuation scheme. So the ACT needs to meet those liabilities. Now, under the standard accounting practices, the rates of return, interest rates, that sort of thing, will be accounted for in revenue, but the capital gains will not be, because we don't own our own superannuation scheme. So that's what the headline, the superannuation return adjustment does. It picks up the capital gains that will eventually pay off that superannuation liability to the Commonwealth, which is flagged to be sort of in the early, probably within the next decade, I think, for the ACT. So that little adjustment there we add on to create what is our focus, which is the headline net operating balance, which is the budget deficit if it's negative for the ACT, or the surplus if it's positive. A couple of other key metrics we look at as well is cash from operating activities, and that's something that accredited agencies look at as well. So effectively, that's your day-to-day sort of operating expenses minus operating revenue minus operating expenses. Net debt, which is a key metric as well, because it looks at your borrowing position, how much you're borrowing versus small amount you might be lending under certain circumstances. And net financial liabilities is basically net debt, but it takes into account that superannuation liability as well. So it's a broader concept again. And please feel free to jump in if I'm going too fast or not explaining something well. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? As I mentioned before, there's a requirement under the Financial Management Act to talk about the economic context as well. And obviously that's going to be an important part of any government when they're deciding on their fiscal priorities. So we have some economic chapters in the budget outlook that look at state final demand, which is kind of the demand of consumers, government, and for capital programs. Gross state product, which is kind of the equivalent of GDP. So it's income for the ACT. Obviously, the labour market is a pretty important part of that as well, because it impacts on payroll tax collection. Housing market as well impacts on returns from suburban land agency in terms of what they can sell. Wage price index and consumer price index, they will feature directly in some of our expenses as well, and our revenue, because some of our fees and charges are linked to those. But we also do, as we said before, from the Financial Management Act, there needs to be that sort of assessment of some of the risks as well. So we do some scenario analysis. So again, I mean, as I said before, the budget outlook sets out the government's fiscal strategy. It said that there are opportunities to focus on key priorities, and this year we've got those identified priorities we talked about through the budget roundtable process in February as well. Next slide, please, Ron. As I mentioned before, we have a credit rating that's assessed by S&P Global, and 2 years ago, September 2023, they downgraded the ACT from a AAA to a AA plus rating. Last year, they put us on negative watch, which means they're going to sort of focus very carefully on how our budget position looked over the next 4 years. What they're focused on really is giving advice to investors in capital markets about the likelihood that our debt might become too unmanageable. Now, we're nowhere near that situation, but the issue with credit ratings is that we're competing in capital markets with other jurisdictions in Australia, but also across the world. So that's what that information is used for. So typically, a credit rating downgrade is associated with an increase in borrowing costs, because we're not viewed to be the AAA rating that we were before. But also, it can be difficult to raise capital in a market we're competing with other semi-governments that have better credit ratings. So it's always something that we need to be mindful of. As I said before, it's what they look at is kind of the cash position, how much we're borrowing, and whether it's at some point we're going to reduce those borrowings in the market. So obviously, you know, it's a simple, as it is with people's households, it's a simple question of income versus expenses and managing those. As I said, they tend to focus mainly on the cash position, the operating position, and typically the ACT, it has run some operating deficits, but we've typically forecast operating surpluses, which is sort of kept the credit rating agency relatively happy. But there are challenges in doing that, obviously, at the moment with the health funding pressures.
I'll just add in there, Scott, the consequence of a rating downgrade, and say if we drop down, rungs, is our borrowing costs go up. There's generally an increased cost in servicing that debt, as we can't, a better credit rating is essentially a lower interest rate in some ways. So if there is a downgrade and we do sort of move down the rungs, our borrowing costs go up, and that has a detrimental impact in terms of our overall budget, and where we can allocate, funds to other things.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a very complex process, and we raised some funds recently just in the aftermath of Trump putting the tariffs on across the world. So it was a very tumultuous time on capital markets. So it just reinforces the need to have a mind to what the credit rating agencies might be saying. So at the bottom there, we also do some key metrics we look at. We talked about net debt before. It's our borrowing position. Net financial liabilities, that you sort of add in some non-debt liabilities, which is essentially superannuation. And net worth is the broadest concept of worth, which takes into account all the assets the ACT owns, so all the physical assets as well, like roads and buildings and that sort of thing. Next slide, please, Ryan. The wellbeing framework is an important part of our budget decision-making process. And I think, as I mentioned at the roundtables in February, the ACT was the first jurisdiction in Australia, one of the first in the world to introduce a wellbeing framework. It's been going for almost 7 years. And we evaluate proposals against various wellbeing domains. You can see on that graphic. And when you look at the initiative descriptions in the budget outlook in 3.2, you'll see that they're all linked to a particular outcome, a particular domain, a wellbeing domain. Sometimes they're linked to more than one, but they'll have a primary domain. So through our decision-making process, an important part is evaluating proposals against which are those wellbeing domains, and looking for a clear link between the proposal itself and how they're going to improve some aspect of that wellbeing domain. Next slide, please, Ryan. Here's the so appropriations. Obviously, the whole purpose of a budget is to fund agencies to do certain things, and they do that through appropriations, which the Assembly votes on. That's effectively what they're voting on, the appropriation bill. The budget itself is kind of the supporting document, and the budget speech the Treasurer gives on Budget Day on the 24th will be sort of framing that appropriation bill. But essentially, it's that's what makes money available to the agencies. There's a couple of types of funding we provide to agency. Controlled recurrent payment, as the name suggests, is kind of what the agency controls itself. If you're familiar with the Commonwealth concepts of administered versus departmental funding is kind of what departments have at their discretion. CRP is a broader concept than that because it includes grants funding that might be picked up through administered funding in the Commonwealth. But essentially, that is at the discretion of the Directorate and based on the purposes for which the Assembly has voted it. Expenses on behalf of the Territory are typically, or could be examples of Commonwealth funding that gets on pass, so education funding, health funding, that sort of thing. Capital injections, as the name suggests, are for the accumulation of assets, so either construction of new assets or extinguishing a liability, like, for example, in relation to employee liabilities.
I'll just add in there, sorry, Ray, if we go back. If you look at the budget papers and if you go to the appropriation type within a BP3, so the budget outlook, or in an agency statement, there's a variety of ways around how we move and shift that funding over the forward estimates, whether that be through a parameter adjustment, a technical adjustment, or a new policy adjustment. And that will dictate how they move and ebb and flow, across forward estimates. So sometimes we shift funding from one year to another because it aligns with our expected delivery date, or that's to align with when we anticipate Commonwealth funding will be received. So it's best when you're looking for a movement of a certain appropriation type or a certain initiative, is to go to the appropriation table, look at the appropriation type, and then it will be under one of those movements within the table.
Thanks, Ray. And we've talked about this before. What most people focus on in budget outlook is 3.2, which is the new decisions, effectively. So there'll be a financial table that looks at the net cost of services to the budget. So if that's a positive, that's obviously a cost to the budget. So it adds to the deficit. In this particular example here, we have an offset that was already existing funding, so it reduces that cost. And there's some text that goes along with it that hopefully gives people an understanding of what the proposal is. So as I said before, these new initiatives are only a small part of the overall funding that agencies get. The bulk of it is through the existing funding they have in their funding base.
I think specifically for this one was one that we selected that does identify where funding will go to specific NGOs, but not all initiatives will actually call out the individual NGOs.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Ryan.
And then for that exact same initiative that you'll find in Budget Outlook, if you then want to be able to look in the corresponding agency statement, this is where you'll then be able to find where that funding is in the agency statement under changes to appropriation. And then we've identified which output and sub-output classes that it sits in.
Yeah, so all funding is appropriate, as I said before, for a purpose, and that maps to these output classes here. So again, it's part of that accountability piece.
Yeah. So if you're looking at the initiative in Budget Outlook, then you would find that corresponding initiative in the CSD agency statements.
Right. Thanks, Ryan.
And there was also a request for continued funding.
Yeah.
So example.
So that often, sometimes, I don't know if it's often, but the government will provide funding for a particular service or function for 1 year, just to test whether it's achieving its objectives. So here's an example of continuing a scheme. So it should be clear in the initiative description if that's what it's intended to do.
I'll just emphasise it's all in the language of that initiative description. So as Scott said, generally where something is following on from some discovery funding or preliminary funding, government, or they want to sort of extend a scheme, they'll say continuation of or extending, something along those lines.
Yeah, thanks.
And this has both capital and expenses. When you look at the corresponding agency statements, you'll see the changes and increase to appropriation broken by both the controlled recurrent payments and capital. And again, we've included which output class and sub-output class that this initiative would fit into.
Yeah, so it's important to read those documents together, I guess, to get that complete picture. Yeah, thanks, Rob. Cost of living statement, as I mentioned before, that's a requirement under the FMA. So it looks at effectively scenario analysis of the impact on individuals in the community of various changes or various taxes and fees. So you'll see that as part of the suite of documents in the budget. Thanks, Rob. And here's an example from last year's budget. I talked through an impact on a particular cohort in the community.
I think there's generally about 8 or 9 different examples provided.
Thanks, Ryan. Expenses, as I mentioned before, we also break them out by, and this is a fairly standard sort of, the ABS has a category of measuring, or a framework for measuring budget expenses that we also follow, and this is doing it here. So it's similar to what you saw in that circle diagram before about where our money goes, but it breaks it down by category. And you can see there, as I mentioned, $9 billion in spending in 24-25. About a third on health, quarter on education. The rest is sort of general public services, basically our salaries, people who work in the ACT public service. And then down the list, I think most of those categories are fairly self-explanatory. Thanks, Rob. Revenue, obviously that's the other side of the coin. Own source, I think what did we have last year? Just check my notes. I think it was about $8 billion, or it must have been about $8 billion in revenue last year. The $8.1 billion in revenue last year. Own source revenue, payroll tax, general rates, land tax, commercial, residential conveyancing, motor vehicle registration was about 2.8 billion, so that's about 35%. So that's the taxes we raise ourselves. We also get a share of the national GST pool, which depends on overall economic conditions, so how consumption is working generally, but also Commonwealth Grants Commission works out relativities between jurisdictions based on population and a few other things. Now GST last year in 24-25 budget for 24-25 was about 2 billion, so that's another quarter of our total revenue. A big part of what we get to is Commonwealth Government grants, either for infrastructure. We've got some contributions to the Commonwealth budget for the pool in Commonwealth Park, some work on the convention centre, a couple of other things. Obviously, we get lots of funding for the light rail as well, roads in general. So it's a very important source. So Commonwealth grants were worth about $1.7 billion for 24-25 in last year's budget, just a bit over 20% of the total. So I guess the difference between the ACT and other jurisdictions is we have that local government focus as well. We have a lot of those functions in terms of rubbish collection, animal management, parks maintenance, local planning. So we have the general rates component of that as well, which other state jurisdictions won't have. But on the other side, we also have the responsibilities of delivering those local government services. Important part, obviously, is, as I mentioned before, is the relationship with the Commonwealth, who, as I said, provides over 20% of our revenue, plus the GST component, which is another 25%. So it's getting close to 50% that sort of comes through the Commonwealth for our revenue. The other part of the budget will be a chapter on the infrastructure program as well, and sort of highlights some of the projects and how they're travelling. As I mentioned, so how they're travelling in terms of funding, but also I mentioned the online database is a good resource for people to look at to get information on individual projects.
I'll just also add, we do a quarterly capital works report available to the public, and that's published online, which also gives quarterly updates on projects and how they're tracking. And that is all across government. So that is another source of reference to see where a project's up to and how it's flowing along. And in terms of the Commonwealth grant space, we publish a list of the grants received throughout the year. And that's available in the budget papers, and people can reference to see what's coming through in terms of Commonwealth revenue and specific Commonwealth initiatives, which the ACT is partnering with in the budget papers.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Ron. So, as I mentioned before, there are some other statements that go along with it that basically relate to various balance sheets, cash flows, changes in equity, that sort of thing. The Reader's Guide of the Budget is actually a really useful document. I sort of recommend anyone who's interested to sort of dive into that and get a step-by-step breakdown of how various numbers relate to each other. The other thing we have as well is a glossary we publish for the budget that sort of talks about key definitions that can be really helpful as well. But it's something that the Reader's Guide of the Budget will sort of step you through where various numbers fit together. The other point, I guess, is, sorry, just on the previous slide, that we break the total territory is broken down into the general government sector, which is kind of what you think of as typical government services, providing health, education, that sort of thing. But we also have public trading enterprises like the SLA, CRA, that effectively have some aspects. Well, they do sometimes, not always, but sometimes may receive government support. They effectively operate as closer to businesses than they do to sort of government functions. So for every set of financial statements that talks about the general government sector, you'll also have a set of statements that talks about the public trading enterprise sector as well.
We also do a whole of government financial statements, which wrap up everything together, and that gives essentially the overall position of the territory. So that's the third element to the financial statement piece.
Yeah, and again, we do those financial statements on a quarterly basis, but there's an annual set of financial statements as well that's audited by the Auditor General. So there's a fairly rigorous process to make sure that the numbers are all correct.
And if anyone's ever looking for any of these quarterly financial statements or the quarterly capital works reporting, it's all on the Treasury website under publications.
Thanks, Ron. So this is the main, as I said, the budget outlook is the main document. The appendices to those are listed there. As mentioned, the consolidated financial statements, it sort of flows on from the previous slide. Key accounting treatments is another a good appendix to look at. Statement of risks, as we mentioned, and statement of sensitivity, they're both required as part of under the FMA for what needs to be in a budget. And whole of government staffing as well can be a useful guide to sort of levels of employment in the public sector. Thanks, Ron.
And the budget consultation appendices also includes every submission that's been received that is allowed to be made public, and lists and acknowledges those that have submitted submissions for the budget process.
As we said before, each agency has its own book, if you like, its statements that talks about the funding received. It also has performed against accountability indicators. So you can see there a list of some of the agencies that fall inside the CEMTED portfolio. So it's not just the budget outlook, but there's a bunch of other documents as well that are produced at budget time as well.
Look a little different from 1 July with the...
Yeah, so that's a good point, actually. We've had, as you all would be aware, we've got the machinery government changes with a couple of directorates merging. So that will need to be reflected in this budget as well. And new statements for those new agencies will need to be set up. So that will be part of this budget process as well, which is kind of complicated for us putting this budget together as well.
An example of that is Digital Canberra within the CEMTED space. So that's now a reporting entity under CEMTED for this budget. But then there's the Health and Community Services Directorate and City and Environment Directorate that have been established as their own reporting entity or their head portfolio agency.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Roy. As I mentioned, the accountability framework, this is a fairly standard sort of framework that all governments use. You can see, I guess, as I point towards the middle of the diagram, you've got your inputs, effectively salaries of public servants, capital inputs, that sort of thing, that deliver services for the community. Hopefully that delivers outcomes that are positive for the community as well. So it's that sort of framework thinking about, we have our outputs that we measure. It can be quite complicated actually linking outputs to outcomes. Like one of our outputs is to produce a budget every year. So we tick that box, but you know, it's a difficult question then to say, well, how does all that flow on to benefit the community? But that's a standard sort of framework that we use. Thanks, Ryan. As we said before, you know, digging down into the agency statements can give you more information on those agencies. It probably won't answer some of those questions that some of you might have about, you know, funding to particular organisations. That's probably something, as we said before, that is best raised with that entity itself, but it sort of looks at a sort of program funding level and by output classes essentially. So it's a even though it's the documents, as you would have seen, are quite complicated, quite detailed, it's protectionized granular. Some people might wish for. Strategic objectives and indicators. Again, this is part of the accountability piece that agencies are, you know, assessed against the indicators they have, and sometimes that will change. They'll be with the approval of the Treasurer. That can be changed if it's regarded as not providing a very meaningful measure of what the agency is doing. Thanks, Ryan. And sort of summarises again the classify the funding by output, so it gives that additional accountability piece as well.
Just some examples.
Yeah, it's an example for the education system. So again, depending on what your particular interest is you might look to delve into some of those more detailed agency statements as well. There's some examples there of output classes as well.
So again, yeah, so we try, a big part of what the Financial Management Act says is you, as far as possible, you've got to be able to compare budgets with budgets. And that also includes the accountability indicators. So you want to be able to give people a sense of continuity and an ability to sort of go back and measure what that agency has been delivering over time. As I said, there will be times when that particular measure might become less relevant. The functions of the agency might change, or it might be regarded as not being particularly useful if new information has come to light. But that can be changed. But the idea is that you try and, as far as possible, have that continuity so people can assess agency performance over time. We talked about the budget consultation before. As I said, it's an all-round year consultation process in terms of submissions, but having an idea about a cadence of when decisions are made and when the budget needs to be finalised is really important. I remember talking to one community organisation who put in a submission for 11 years, and it was always a month before the budget was actually released, so it was too late then to influence the outcome. But they've since actually put in a budget much earlier in the year, which was welcome, and it enabled them to sort of have an input to that current year's budget.
I think that might be a natural segue, just for context, in actually getting to a budget and preparing and going through all the system processes. It's quite a lengthy exercise and requires quite a bit of effort internally. So we have to do a consolidation at a entity, whole of government level, and so forth. So it requires a lot of inputs to go in that are quite complex to get us to the finished product. So hence an earlier submission allows that to be filtered in for us to step through the processes, because we have to essentially shut things down 5-6 weeks out just to get to a finished product.
Exactly. I mean, it's a massive process. You can make, well, I mentioned before the mulk changes. I think that the team was working on the weekend to make all the financial adjustments necessary for that. And there was over 1,500 individual adjustments needed in our financial system to make that work. That's on top of all the adjustments necessary for the decisions in budget, plus all those technical adjustments we talked about before that are linked to things like indexation. So it's quite a complex process. And then what you've got to do is sort of eliminate all those inter-agency transactions that don't impact on the overall net position of the government. So, and that then lets you sort of work out, well, what, based on this deficit, what sort of borrowings are we going to need across the forward estimates, and therefore what are interest costs going to be based on the assumptions of where interest rates are at the moment. So it is quite a complex process, and I marvel just at the ability of that team to pull it all together at the last minute. Thanks, Ro. So as mentioned before, there's lots of ways to provide input, budget submissions all year round, but just with that caveat that you should be mindful of when the key points in the budget process are. A survey that was available in February, March this year to get views from the broader community. And as I said, the budget roundtable sessions as well in February were quite valuable also. Thanks, Ryan. There's a little more details there about how you can provide information through a submission.
And our team monitors the budget consultation website. So any submission that comes in, the team here will pick up, and that will go to relevant directorates and stakeholders and ministers, so that input can be considered.
Thanks, Ryan. And some additional details there from the budget consultation website that you can access at that link.
And if anyone has any issues ever with the Your Say site, there's also an email address that submissions could be directly emailed through. And then anything that is allowed to be made public is made public on the budget consultation input received website. We still list items that have been received, just mark them as confidential, and clearly they're not uploaded to the website, but they are shared with agencies and directorates for briefing up to ministers.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, that's the end of the slideshow. Welcome any questions you might have.
Great, thank you for providing that information. Do people want to just feel free to ask questions, pop on your mic or do it in the chat. I can read out your questions. Oh, we have one question from Quadro saying, can the team comment on what early budget submission will look like in this instance? Thank you.
We would generally say probably until February if possible, in order for that briefing to have occurred up to the minister, because business cases are actually due to Treasury at the end of January, beginning of February for their, I suppose, assessment and then development and consideration by Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet.
So yeah, I guess to have the maximum impact probably by the end of the calendar year before next year's budget. We don't always know when the budget's going to be. That's a challenge. But if you work on sort of towards the end of that calendar year, that's probably the best bet.
And I will say that anything received after that period, it's not that it doesn't ever progress in any way. It is still provided for agencies and ministers for future budget processes, which is why the site and email address is open year round.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We have another question from Jeff. The question is, if a budget ask is unsuccessful in the 25-26 budget, what influence could a submission have in the budget review or otherwise outside of the main budget cycle?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as we said before, but submissions, will inform future budgets as well, but potentially resubmitting that submission to identify it's still a priority would be helpful. Budget review doesn't necessarily. Budget review only helps, I guess, if there's a supplementary appropriation, which doesn't always happen. So you're more than welcome to try and resubmit in advance of budget review, but typically the budget is the big decision-making point. So I would recommend probably resubmitting or also talking to the agency to see whether the information contained could be changed. If there was some particular aspect that might be more informative, potentially asking them at that point. So yeah, basically I think probably just resubmitting potentially with a tweak if you think that further information has come to light, or you've talked to the relevant agency and they have some views on what additional information might be useful.
I think it is definitely important talking to the agency and maybe seeking feedback, because maybe elements of the submission have actually been incorporated into another program and it might not be as evident. It's also important to know that budget consultation process is not a manner or mechanism for direct funding. That is the grants process that I would strongly encourage people to look into. It's a way for helping inform government of what are the priorities of and where investment may be needed, but it's definitely not for direct investment.
And just to add on to Scott's comment, budget reviews are highly variable around what their intent is, depending on the needs of the community. Like this year was a health investment, so again, there's no harm in putting a submission in budget review. However, budget is generally the key sort of strategic point to inform priorities moving forward.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to turn on your microphone or pop it in the chat.
Hi, Leanne. It's Jeff here from CARE. Again, sorry to ask another question. I just was wondering, in terms of the new appropriations, new initiatives, in reading the tables in the budget papers, often there's offsets, either expenses or revenue or capital. There's also other things like the capital side of things and depreciation. I just wonder if you could step us through the different elements of those tables and let us know which we should really take as the headline figure when we're interpreting those tables.
Yeah, so I guess that the headline figure is probably that net cost of services that's at the bottom of the initiative description. That reveals the impact on the budget. But the expense line itself is also important because effectively that is the total amount the government's committing. There may be an offset. So it may have been, an example might be the government was aware that this spending would be required in the future, and they put a provision aside in the budget, which is kind of a budgeting, a way of trying to make your future budgets as accurate as possible. So an example might be that a particular service will be starting in 2 years' time, and you have a guess at what the cost will be, and you put that as a central provision, so it's in the bottom line, so the total impact doesn't hit the deficit. In that case, the offset is probably not so relevant. It's actually what the expense is the government's committing to that particular program. Another example of offset might be you say, or the government says that they want to commit a certain amount of funding to a particular initiative, but they say to the agency, we want you to offset that against your existing funding base. And that's their way of saying, well, we think that's a bigger priority than some of the other things you're doing. In that example, the agency itself would have to identify some things of a lower priority in consultation with their minister and offset it that way. Capital is another example where we often have provisions for projects we know that are coming along. Obviously, light rail, we've had provisions for that for the future development for a number of years. So it really depends. But Jeff, I'd say probably the expense line for the community is the bit about, well, how much money is government committing to that particular purpose? The net cost of services measures what's the impact on the budget.
I think just going back to a point Rowena raised is that the initiative description for new appropriations or new initiatives is the key readable metric, because each of those various components, say there's one with capital and expenses, they'll go into separate appropriation tables because there's a capital appropriation and then there's an expense appropriation. So I'd look at it from the initiative description first, and then each of those points will then flow into the relevant appropriation table naturally. And depreciation is a technical adjustment that we put in as a non-cash expense that really reflects the useful life of the asset. And the net cost of services will be what it's costing to the government. But as Scott said, that expense line is the gross amount that we're spending. And a really common offset is generally just the redirection of staff internally within ACT government to support that, service or whatever's happening. And that's commonly incorporated as an offset.
Yeah, so that's an important point that Tom just raised. The depreciation is not something we fund, so it's not appropriated, but it's part of that accruals framework where you say we have to recognise the cost of maintaining capital and that sort of thing. So.
And another example is, say, concessional loans in sustainable household scheme. We recognise non-cash expenses associated with the delivery of the concessional component of that loan. And, as we have an accrual-based HNOB that incorporates all expenses, we pull in the cash and non-cash expenses, unlike the Commonwealth, because we also incorporate balance sheet into how we formulate that HNOB.
Great, thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, cool. Well, thank you for providing all that information. I hope everyone has gained some new knowledge and understanding around how to read ACT budget papers. So in following days, I will send out a link to the recording. This will be uploaded to ACTCOSS's YouTube channel, and also an evaluation form, which I've popped in the chat, just about, how the training can improve, what you liked about it, etc. I also recommend that you register for our upcoming training opportunities in June. We have a workshop on helping shape gas prices in the ACT. We have an ACT budget debrief coming up at the end of June, and a post-budget forum. We also have the information session, which Scott mentioned earlier, about the ACT budget process. That's in August. And you can see all this information just on our website. Yeah, that's everything. Thanks again for joining, and thanks for that presentation. It was really useful. If anyone has any questions or queries after, feel free to shoot me an email and I can forward those on.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.